What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are back with Night Terrors, and I'm curious to see how you guys feel about the ending of this because it's a little wonky. So what this does is this initially opens up with a young girl who basically wakes up from a dream. And for those of you guys who are just joining us, the long and short of Night Terrors is that there is a guy named Insomnia whose family died during a fight between these evil version of Batman, basically, and the Justice League, right? The building collapsed and they were killed and so on and so forth. Because of that, he took what was previously called the Dream Stone, which allowed a person to manipulate reality by bringing their dreams into the real world, and then in turn, once it had become the Nightmare Stone, used it for his own ends. And we'll kind of talk a little bit more about that as we get further through this story. But with this girl waking up after the entire world had been put to sleep, initially her nightmares are kind of dismissed by her parents, right? When she talks about like the evil Justice League and so on and so forth. But then she refers to the man with no eyelids, who of course we know is Insomnia. Her parents saw the exact same guy. That of course is also dismissed to a degree, but then we suddenly have this moment where these kind of nightmare members of the Justice League are yanked into the real world by Insomnia himself. And so following that, the rest of the Justice League responds exactly as you would expect them to. And it's not even just the Justice League. It's the Justice League and like a whole host of heroes, which also includes Sandman. Now, again, I called it before that as soon as they brought Sandman back, right, as soon as Wesley Dodds showed back up, I was like, okay, they're gonna basically find a way to bring him back. And that is in effect what they are going to do, although you'll see as we get further through this seemingly exactly how they're going to do it. But Insomnia making his move, he actually ends up using Boston Brand. And what he does is he kind of talks about this idea that Boston Brand himself is kind of the guy that made all this possible. And in reality, it's true. It was never the intention of Deadman to do that, right? The intention of Deadman was to possess Batman and then eventually enter into the mind of Insomnia and then basically try to find a way to defeat him. But by bringing the Nightmare Stone directly to him, he literally gave him exactly what he was looking for. It was just one gigantic ruse. And so what he does, sort of toying with Boston Brand, is says, look, this all went according to plan. You made all this happen. Let me give you your just reward. And what he ends up doing is he actually ends up presenting Boston Brand with his own family after kind of putting him into a bit of a trance, possibly even sleeping. Technically, Boston Brand is dead, so he doesn't really sleep, but the fact remains that he's sort of brought in by this whole thing, kind of hoodwinked, right, by like this family that he imagines himself having some measure of normalcy in this life that is otherwise abnormal. And what I mean by that is when it comes to Boston Brand, and we haven't really talked about him too much, he is quite literally a dead guy, right? He's basically a ghost, and he's kind of doomed to seemingly spend eternity just watching these individuals living their lives, but never actually being able to join their lives at all. So it is a really interesting role, possibly curse. I guess it really depends on how you look at it. But the one thing he's always longed for is a family of his own. And he basically gets it. And so it kind of takes him out of commission for a temporary period of time. Now, following that, the rest of the Justice League basically responds with Deadman out of the equation and tries to defeat him like where they can, when they can. But there's not a whole lot they can do here, right? Now, one of the things that I also want to draw your attention to, this is written by some top-notch writers over at DC Comics, right? Chip Zdarsky, Matt Rosenberg, and so on. But it doesn't feel like it, right? Because it's one of these things where it's kind of written almost like a campy 1960s type of story, which I guess maybe it's been this way up to this point, but it just kind of feels more noticeable now than it has in the past. But at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter, right? The Justice League cannot overtake this guy. They can't beat this guy as easily as they had hoped. And so it's one of these things where he even makes a kind of mockery of like the Hall of Heroes, right? Like, you guys keep trophies from your accomplishments from the various villains that you've defeated. What kind of heroes need trophies, right? Let me present you with my trophies, and then forces them to fight their own nightmarish versions of themselves. Now, one of the things that I do want to specify here is that these nightmarish versions have appeared in their own individual dreams, but they are basically opposites, right? Caricatures of their actual selves. And so it's interesting to see the Justice League fighting kind of like their evil counterparts, if you want to call it that. But even when you have Wesley Dodds trying to wake up Boston Brand from this kind of trance type experience, eventually he does, right? He starts to realize this whole thing is a nightmare, none of it's real, and basically starts to move away from it, and then immediately goes after Insomnia. And in fact, he almost kind of leans into his punishment, right? Even going so far as to say, I gave up on that kind of life a long time ago, long before I died, in fact. And so in that moment, Boston Brand is like seized by insomnia and forced to kind of experience this sort of horrendous life that he lives, right? He says, this is you alone. I see you were already living your nightmare. Before, you always craved the spotlight, and that was taken along with your life. So you've been trapped as this audience, forced to watch others live, never able to move on. And the response of Boston is, if I'm trapped here, then I'll make sure you're trapped with me. And so this is a very important moment, because now the fight simply just takes place between Insomnia and Boston Brand. We don't really see a whole lot of it. Instead, you just kind of transition to the various superheroes who are facing off against their evil demonic selves. I mean, there's not really a whole lot doing here. It's kind of interesting a little bit, but not really overly important. But between Boston Brand and Insomnia, this is interesting, because Boston's response is like, you're letting the Nightmare Stone corrupt you. It called for you. It wanted you to free it. I felt it too. It played on my anger left over from when I died. But the response of Insomnia is, but what did you lose? Your life, the spotlight, that's it. I lost everything. Now, something that I want to specify here, and this is what's really interesting when it comes to the different perceptions of Boston Brand and Insomnia, it's a matter of priorities. It's a matter of significance, what matters the most. In the mind of Insomnia, the most important thing that he had was his family, right? It was his wife and it was his 2 kids. They were everything, right? And like any father who's any measure of a father, he would willingly give his life for his family in order to keep them safe. I can't imagine any kind of a father and husband who wouldn't do that. But for Boston Brand, it was really just kind of him living his life with a goal out there that was never ever achieved, right? Unfinished business, if we want to reference the Casper film from back in the 1990s. But the important distinction here is that each of these guys views their own individual life or their own individual loss as a seemingly important thing. And they're trying to make comparisons, right? They're kind of trying to equal these two things out, right? Like this is equal to this and so on and so forth, but it's all a matter of perception, right? They're literally fighting over who's struggled the most. And so the response of Deadman is, nothing is going to bring your family back, Insomnia. This does not honor them. Please, let's stop this together. And Insomnia's response is, you're right. The world knows the truth now. I won, but that's not enough. The Justice League could have saved my family and they didn't. I know how to honor my family. I punish the heroes. And so what you end up getting is the Justice League that transitions to Arkham, where they basically pick up with John Dee. Now, John Dee is a character that has been referenced heavily over the course of this story, but he's also incredibly obscure unless you're like a super hardcore DC Comics fan. So the idea behind John Dee is this is basically Dr. Destiny. And Dr. Destiny was a guy who would come into possession of the Dreamstone at some point along the line and then had corrupted it and turned it into the Nightmare Stone. But he was fearful of what it was capable of, and that's why he hid it. Because if a person were able to attain the Nightmare Stone and use it for their own ends, you'd see exactly what you're seeing now. This person using the nightmares of the world and bringing them into reality. It's horrifying, right? Just because of the pure imagination that takes place in our subconscious when we're dreaming, right? It's 100% pure, unadulterated imagination. That's it. We can't even control it, right? So if your subconscious just kind of dreams these wild and crazy concepts up, and somebody in possession of the Nightmare Stone decides to bring those things into reality, that could lead to the destruction of anything and everything. And in fact, it could even lead to the destruction of all reality. So it's no small wonder why this guy got rid of this thing, right? Tried to hide it between realities in a place that nobody could access. And so what you end up having is Batman presenting this to Wesley Dodds, who decides to take it, right? He says, allow me. I always felt a connection to it. I always dreamed of being part of something bigger. Now, that's an important bit of Sandman's history, right? Wesley Dodds was always the guy who wanted to be a part of like the greater superhero community. He never really was, right? But even beyond the superhero community itself, ever since his first encounter with Dream of the Endless, he always kind of wanted to walk among the gods. So even when he was part part of the Justice Society of America, he was a person who was able to contribute to the team, but he was never really a powered being in the sense that he wasn't really powered like the original Green Lantern Alan Scott, right? Or the original Flash Jay Garrick, or Dr. Fate, or somebody along those lines. But even in the midst of all of this, try as they might, they all find themselves corrupted by the power of insomnia, because it says, you think you can handle the Dreamstone's power, Wesley Dodds, you're nothing but some old zombie, you're out of your league. Now the whole world sees the heroes, like I do, as monsters. And there's a bit of bickering back and forth between the two of them, but Wesley Dodds makes this really good case where he says that Nightmare Stone should never be in the real world, Insomnia, and that where Insomnia himself responds by saying like, give it to me or I'll kill you like I killed Deadman. Of course, we end up finding out that Deadman is actually alive, right? He just kind of faked his death. It was a great big huge ruse, that kind of thing. And he ends up seizing control of Insomnia himself and basically dragging him back into arguably the nightmare realm, the afterlife, whatever you want to call it. And it's a bit murky here because technically Insomnia is not dead. Right? He's not a guy who is deceased. He's a living person who effectively augmented himself using a combination of the powers that he got from the whole Lazarus Planet event when he was doused with the Lazarus Pit chemicals and gained abilities, along with what he's now doing, which is the Nightmare Stone. But by seizing him, Boston Brand kind of throws him into this realm, and then Boston Brand enters as well. And it really gives the implication that he's going on to the afterlife. He says, it's time I went on a new adventure, Wesley. My deal with Ramakrishna was over lifetimes ago. For those of you guys who don't know what that means, when Boston Brand was killed, right, because he was literally murdered, he ended up striking a deal with Ramakrishna, who's a character that's part of like the John Constantine, Zatanna mythos in DC, right, like all that kind of magic and mysticism, and that she would give him the ability to basically achieve his revenge. He did, but then he's also kind of lingered ever since. And so that's what he's referencing, right? He says, I'm sick of being in the audience, no more watching the living. I need to be the star again. Don't you hear it? They're cheering for me. And so it's almost like he kind of dies, right? Now, Insomnia himself falls into what really is his own nightmare, although arguably you could say he basically ends up falling into hell. But he wakes up surrounded by his family, right, the people that he misses the most, only for them to turn into kind of like their nightmare selves, to start chewing on him, consuming him, so on and so forth. Then you get like flames, fire, and all that kind of good stuff. So it really looks like he was just taken to hell by Deadman, and he's just going to spend eternity there. Because for those of you guys who aren't familiar with that, heaven and hell do exist in DC Comics. That is a part of their mythos. The Judeo-Christian philosophy of like the afterlife, that's a very big part of like the whole entire other side of the superhero landscape in DC. But following that, for Wesley Dodds, the question's asked by Zatanna whether or not he's ready to basically go back to his life, right? Or really go back to being dead, right? His mission's more or less quote unquote done. And so of course you have her kind of casting the spell, rest in peace. And then he basically goes back to slumbering. And then of course Batman passes out because Deadman had basically pushed his body to the brink by keeping him not really awake, but by keeping his body from being able to rest the way it normally does when we're sleeping. No one really knows when he's going to recover, so that's going to kind of feed into the Batman stories. Maybe Damian Wayne will end up becoming Batman and instead, not entirely sure. But for Sandman Wesley, this is where things get interesting, because I think this story in a lot of ways will draw interest to his character where it didn't previously exist. Whether or not that would see a successful solo series, I'm not entirely sure, but apparently he's getting one. So I will go so far as to argue that Sandman solo series is just going to be like the lost tales of Wesley Dodds, things that he was doing before he died. And if that proves to be popular, DC's going to be like, and he's back through like whatever means, comic book logic, and that's basically it. But the bigger conversation here takes place between like Mr. Terrific, Wonder Woman, and Superman, where they talk about how like the day saved, Insomnia has been defeated, but everything feels so wrong. And the statement of Wonder Woman is, it's because we didn't win today, right? Insomnia did, because he got exactly what he wanted. People are now terrified of the Justice League. This little girl that we talked about at the beginning of the story starts taking down these little drawings that she had made for the Justice League of America, these heroes that she kind of idolized. She more or less sees them as horrifying things. People have lost faith in them. Now, this is when the ending of the story gets what we in the comic book scene refer to as Goofy. So what this does is it transitions over to Amanda Waller. That's not the Goofy part. Amanda Waller's amazing, right? Amanda Waller's just absolutely awesome. But what she talks about is that like the tide's turning, right? That like society is kind of turning against the Justice League of America. And she talks about how Insomnia had actually given 2 gifts. The first was the Helmet of Hate on Lazarus Island, the ability to channel the hate of various people who were out there. And then of course, the Nightmare Stone, which was stolen during all the chaos and all the pandemonium. But somebody out there whose identity is a total mystery basically talks about how they want to use these things, right? This person says, I need to see that they can't just use smiles to solve all our problems. That's not real, right? That's like the only real motivation that we get. So Amanda Waller hands the helmet and the Nightmare Stone over to this person who fuses the 2 of them together and then refers to themselves as Dr. Hate. The outfit and everything looks pretty dope, but the whole thing feels kind of dumb. So I'm sort of curious to see where DC goes with it. But with that being said, guys, let me know down in the comments how you feel about this story. I feel like I already know what you guys are going to say. If you want to get caught up on Night Terrors, make sure you click this link to the playlist, and I will catch you all later. Peace.